Hello everyone. Today I will be presenting my research proposal, which is titled The Uniqueness of the Keralite Jewish Diaspora, an analysis of the ongoing conceptualization of identity amongst the Keralite Jews in Israel. To get started off right away, the abstract. The earliest historical records indicate that an ancient Jewish community arrived on the shores of Cochin in the South Indian state of Kerala during the time of the biblical King Solomon. For nearly 2,500 years, the Cochin Jewish community lived in relative harmony with its Hindu, Christian, and Muslim neighbors and had adopted the language, Malayalam, and many of the cultural customs of the indigenous Malayalee population. In the 20th century, after the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948, the Keralite Jewish population immigrated en masse to the nascent and warring state. The motivation for moving seems to be mainly a religious one, with social and political factors operative as well. However, the settlement of their community, numbering roughly 10,000, is the area of my interest. I am compelled to ascertain how the Keralite Jews, Cochinim, as they are called in Hebrew because they primarily hail from the city of Cochin in Kerala, assimilated into the diverse assortment of cultures that was flooding into the new state in the 1950s. So the main questions are, how did they come to conceptualize their identity as South Indian Jews? Those who were dissimilar from the North Indian Jews, as well as Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Had they experienced racism, marginalization, or any other kinds of social adversity that made them unique in comparison to other diasporic groups that had come to Israel? Given that there was largely a unique absence of anti-Semitic sentiment in South India, had they dismantled all their businesses and communal ties in Kerala only to experience new social pressures in a state that was only beginning to mobilize its infrastructure? Are the Cochinim at risk of ceasing to exist because of intermarriage with Israelis of different ethnic and genetic backgrounds? Do young and old Cochinim desire to retain their former Keralite identities? There are dynamic themes operative in this situation, and I wish to explore those and explain those with my research. So brief introduction. Kerala has been home to many religions, visitors, refugees, conquerors, and colonizers. Very pluralistic society with interweaving of culture and religious tradition. And the Cochinim had integrated themselves in this tapestry for over a millennia. So they were indeed accustomed to assimilation. So my research primarily seeks to explore how that prowess of assimilation has endured in the context of the 20th century, and I will touch on some philosophical implications that this migration has. An interdisciplinary approach will surely merit a broad understanding of the Cochin Jewish community and reveal patterns about their migration and subsequent assimilation. It's just after the realization of the Zionist vision that the Keralite Jews abandoned generations of wealth, land, and industry to make home a barren desert in a contentious part of the Levant. So I will explore how the Cochinim navigated through the conundrums of identity in a new state of Israel that fostered a new Jewish identity, the Israeli Jew, an ethno-national identity that is comprised of a bewildering array of different ethnic backgrounds. My first hypothesis is that because the Cochinim may have subscribed to Zionism, they had the religious motivation of making Aliyah, and so although they were ethnically dissimilar from the predominant Ashkenazim that populated Israel at the time, the Cochinim experienced an unprecedented sentiment of inclusion from their ethno-religious kin, not excluding racist sentiments that were prevalent upon their migration that also persist to this day. Theoretically, in Jewish tradition, if you or someone in your family has not converted to Judaism, your ancestors can be traced back to the original 12 tribes that resided in the ancient biblical kingdom of David. That's what makes an ethno-religious group like Jews unique, even if they are from South India, Algeria, Poland, or Jamaica. Secondly, I hypothesize that the Cochinim historically regarded their Indian identities as a secondary feature of their identities. It became increasingly less operative subsequent to their migration and settlement. Therefore, it was not only a motivation to acclimate to what was mainstream Israeli culture, which was then dominated by Ashkenazi or European Jewry, but an ease in shedding their Indian language, culture, and customs, which was always secondary in the conceptualization of their identity. After all, the Cochinim arrived in Kerala as a migratory people, and one could surmise that this feature of the Cochinim endured until the 20th century. So hypothesis 2 is being Indian a secondary feature of the Cochinim, and hypothesis 1, did they feel a sense of inclusion immediately upon their arrival because they were with their ethno-religious kin. Third, a somewhat peripheral hypothesis, I hypothesize that in the next 2 to 4 generations there will be very few Israeli Jews of complete Keralite Jewish background due to ethnic admixture and in the cosmopolitan society of Israel. This highlights the time-sensitive nature of this research generally. Fourthly, if the first 2 hypotheses are moot, I had hypothesized that the assimilation of the Cochinim did entail obstacles in achieving social and economic mobility in the latter half of the 20th century in Israel. And this is how I plan to explore, explain, and describe this research. My proposed study is for uncovering this single yet holistic case study. Would necessitate a trifold approach that employs different qualitative, academically investigative methodologies that include history, anthropology, sociology, and religious studies. The main crux of my qualitative research methods combine population-based and document-based research to produce multiple sources of data. These include surveys and polls, interviews, observations, online and literature research. And understanding the context of the migration of the Cochinim and their settlement is also important because, equipped with a historical lens, I would analyze the history of the Jewish diaspora, the historical emergence of Israel in the 19th and 20th century, and make retrospective extrapolations about the relationship of the Cochinim to these historical variables to inform my hypothesis. The historical approach will ensure that all relevant elements will be used to describe with detail the context of the case study. I've included a big bibliography of the academics' works I would use to better understand the historical and social context. An anthropological approach would be used in conducting in-field studies and ethnographic research. Although I will not be able to do this to its full degree, I have conducted a brief pilot study when I stayed in the homes of some Cochinim and attended synagogue services with Cochinim in Israel, making direct observations. I will be able to incorporate these field notes into my research. A big part of my research would be conducting comprehensive and qualitative interviews with the young people among the Cochinim, as well as observations of the remaining elderly Cochin Jews who still retain their Indian identity to better understand their cultural and political ties to India and Israel. I have recorded interviews in India and Israel with Cochinim in a snapshot data collection fashion. This interpretive approach of handling this data would merit the affirmation or the rebuffing of my hypotheses, and I will also make additional interviews with some influential figures amongst the Cochinim. Finally, as far as further contextual analyses, I would also study historical documents and archival data through the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics to see the statistics of those who decide to stay in their original settlements and see what kind of drift they may be from Indian Jewish culture towards Israeli culture. This triangulation of sources in this research will ensure the confidence of my outcomes, for it shall provide sufficient data and evidence. I will also combine my case study with some qualitative surveys. Through the contacts I have made, I will be able to acquire roughly 50 respondents of different age ranges amongst the Cochinim in Israel to ask them pertinent questions that will yield insight into my research. These surveys will be available in English and in Hebrew, and they resemble what we see on the screen here. And then the surveys will elicit thematic analyses, and I will be able to make extrapolations and deductions that will better inform my hypotheses. These survey questions are semi-structured and open-ended, and they seek to be representative and capture the conditions of the Cochinim with some internal validity. Although these are generalized, I hope for these to be generalizable, but they shall be incorporated into the hypotheses. Limitations, although COVID-19 is certainly a big factor, I envision no problems reaching out to various members of the Cochinim via social media, WhatsApp, Zoom, or Facebook. I'm also fluent in Malayalam, which is the language that is still spoken by the elderly generation, and there are time differences. Language difference would be Hebrew. Defining the boundaries of the case and the appropriate amount of research it ought to merit is a challenge in this study. I think that sole reliance upon self-reported data may result in unsubstantiated observations that may hinge on speculative conclusions and overgeneralization of themes. But I shall seek to overcome this limitation by aiming for specificity, avoiding biases, and being subjective and intentional with my analyses. Ethical issues are afoot. These are somewhat traumatic and personal events. I shall be diligent in my communication and preface and brief the respondents with the understanding that they should only reveal and confide information within the bounds of their own comfort. To conclude, this understanding of the existence and living conditions of minorities in societies is an academic exercise that evokes humility and appreciation for the dynamism of societies. I would argue that this is one of the principal lessons that can be drawn from researching this case. By the end of the research, I hope to find a more finite understanding, perspective on what the future of this ancient community is, and on a more of a macro scale, although Jews from all over the world have migrated to the state of Israel subsequent to its creation, each community offers more perspective into what the state of Israel means to the Jews, albeit at the expense of indigenous Palestinians, and may offer a stronger and more informed approach to understanding and possibly alleviating the political and national strife that exists in the region today. And I know I'm way over time here, but here are just some photos I have of some Cochinim who I visited in Israel. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.